sure what is going on, if you guys can see this or not yet. So I'm just going to go ahead. Sorry, I was having a bit of technical difficulties. So thank you so much for bearing with me during this time. Okay, let's go ahead and let's take a deeper look at what is going on in China with regards to the Uyghurs. And we're going to kind of break this down. I have to say, doing the research on this is obviously very difficult because China is very closed off. China doesn't give out a lot of information. China keeps things very close to the chest. So it's really difficult to get a look at what's going on, good or bad. Now, a lot of people think suspiciously that if you're hiding things, which typically is the case, that if you're hiding things, then you're up to no good. But I have to give you a disclaimer about Asian people, Asian cultures, is that that's not necessarily the case with Asians. In our culture, we are very secretive when it comes to negative things about our family, about our lives, and that extends all the way to the country. So even things that, you know, a typical Western family would not find embarrassing, would not think is a bad thing for others to know about, Asian families have a tendency to keep those things very quiet, very private. Shame is a big aspect of Asian culture. So you have to understand that part of China's secrecy might not be because they're doing something wrong, but because they're ashamed of what is happening inside of their own country. This is a domestic issue. This is internal. These are not outsiders. This is Chinese against Chinese in a way. So you can understand where they would feel like maybe we should keep this one a little bit quiet. So I'm going to do my best to kind of break this down now that we're rolling here. I have no idea if what China is doing is to combat extremism is the right method. It might be, but it might not be. So I'm not saying that it is or isn't. I'm saying I genuinely do not know. And my hope is that through opening our eyes and opening up the conversation about all of this and kind of really assessing what's really going on, my hope is that we begin to think about the problem and we begin to brainstorm solutions rather than pointing the finger at one another. It's very easy to point the finger and say, wow, you're committing human rights abuses. Look at you, you're wrong. This is terrible. This is awful. Somebody needs to stop you. That's a narrative that I think the West really would like to have continue to propagate against China. Somebody must stop you. We must stop you. That's how we get into wars. But my point is, I'm hoping that in opening up this conversation and try to keep an open mind. You might already have your ideas on what's going on over there. You might feel like it's one way or the other. But I'm just going to ask you to keep an open mind because this is a worldwide problem and we do need to brainstorm solutions. We need to open up that dialogue rather than just say everybody's doing it the wrong way. There are certainly worse ways than others to handle a problem of domestic extremism. So my hope is that we don't end up demonizing China to the point where we usher in another Cold War, or we try to affect regime change in some way, or we sanction them to where it ends up harming the people, and just kind of doing things to them that ultimately put them in a worse off position, like Afghanistan and Libya, for example. So let's go ahead and get started. In order to understand the conflict of the plight or the situation in China in regards to the Uyghurs, we need to know who the Uyghurs are and where they came from. So modern Western scholars do not think that the Uyghurs come from the Turkic people. People think that the Uyghurs are ethnically different or different in some way from Han Chinese, and Western scholars actually cannot really link the current Uyghurs to ancient Uyghurs. They think that the current Uyghurs are more of an ethnic blend of a many variety of people because that area of China has been conquered by a lot of different groups of people throughout thousands of years. So that region of China, which is now known as Xinjiang, that region was first part of the Jin dynasty, and then which was Han Chinese, and then it was overtaken by, I believe after that it was taken by Turkic people. They came along on the Silk Road during the trade. They ended up in that region. And then the area changed hands and it became under Mongol rule for a really long time. Genghis Khan had control over the region. And then after several hundred years, it went back under Chinese control, under Han Chinese control. And so that region is not really historically, I wouldn't say it belongs to any one people. One of the big questions people have is, are the Uyghurs, this is their homeland, they belong there, the Chinese want that land. You can't really make that claim when it comes to this particular region. If you go way back, it was Han Chinese, and then it goes to the Turkic people who came through the West on the Silk Road, and then it went to the Mongols, and then it went back to the Han Chinese, so it kind of goes on and on. So modern Western scholars do not think they can actually ethnically link these current Uyghurs to the ancient Uyghurs. They believe what happened over time was that conquerors came. So when the Turkic people came, they ended up conquering the people that were there, the Uyghur people, or there's just so many different groups of people. Trying to study that region historically is very, very challenging. There's a whole book on it. And they, usually the people in power or the people who are subjugated by the people in power end up adopting the culture, end up adopting the language, end up adopting the religion. And that's what they believe is the current Uyghur people are people who were maybe oppressed, subjugated, or a blend of the people, because over hundreds of years, people intermixed. Various different people came around the world and intermixed in that region. And the current modern Uyghur people adopted a culture, adopted a language, and even adopted a religion that wasn't historically theirs necessarily. It depends on what you think of that, on how you categorize what's historical. We do know that the Uyghur people were Buddhist until about 930, and then that's when there was the bringing in of Islam to the Uyghur people. Now, the Uyghur people have historically been Hanafi. They're Sunni Muslims, and they practice under the school of Hanafi. Most of them now, so that was sort of traditional, most of them now are Sufi, which is more of a mystical version of Islam. However, there has been a recent push, and modern recent Uyghurs are actually, many, not all of them by any means. The majority are Sufis. The majority are Sunni Muslims, Sufis. They're not at all Wahhabists, but there has been an influx of Wahhabism into the region. And this started, you kind of have to back up a little bit going into the 1920s. So the 1920s through the 1940s, China and Russia, you've got the big world powers that are vying for imperialism. They're trying to march around the world and take over a lot of places. And Russia, the USSR, Stalin was one of those people. And in the 20s and the 40s, through the 40s, Stalin was supporting uprisings of separatist movements that were going on in that region of Xinjiang. The Turkic people had that region for a while, mixed with Han people, and China came in again and sort of reconquered the area. And there were some people that did not want to be part of China. However, there was a large group of Muslim Chinese who did want that region to be part of China. They actually battled each other, so it was Muslim on Muslim fighting. So, and the Chinese Muslims ended up winning that war, and so that region remained under the current Chinese, what's now modern China. So the 20s through the 30s, Stalin actually supported the uprisings by separatists in order to weaken China. And in return, China ended up ultimately having a problem with Russia. So China did this was fast forward quite a few years, you get into the 60s, the 70s, really towards the late 70s and into the 80s, China made a giant mistake. China did what the United States did, and they joined the United States, interestingly, on this one, along with some other countries, in supporting, arming, and training the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The Soviets were in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen, which we now know have later become the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The Mujahideen were supported by the United States, trained by the CIA, and guess what? China was in on that too. China ended up actually opening up camps in China, in that Xinjiang region, during that time to bring in the Mujahideen and train them. and also allowed for many in the Xinjiang region, many of the Muslims in that region, to join in with the fighters. I don't know if the United States or if China back in the late 70s, early 80s really understood what that was going to ultimately lead to. I don't know if they really understood that these were, that this form of Islam, this Wahhabism, would end up being so radical and causing as much harm as it has throughout the Middle East and throughout Asia. And even here in the United States, we've of course had some attacks. I don't know if China really realized what they were setting themselves up for, but nonetheless, it happened. And they were just really hell-bent on stopping Russia. And because of that, they armed and propagated the Mujahideen and even brought them into their own country. And so this was a real big problem. To also help combat the Soviets and the spread of the Soviet Union, in the 80s, China actually also began, so not only did they open up these camps where they were training Mujahideen and encouraging some of their own Muslims to join in the mid-80s, in about 1985, China actually began to open up pilgrimage to Mecca. So they started to allow some of their Uyghur Muslims and Han Muslims, they're the Hui people, they actually started to allow them to go and do their pilgrimage to Mecca, which if you're a Muslim, you believe you must do this one time in your life. And they opened this up for pilgrimage to Mecca. And there, but it was very expensive. It's a long journey. So only those who were supported by the people or by the government would be able to go. And a lot of times that were the imams. And then the imams would go to Saudi Arabia, and they'd go to Mecca, and they would ultimately end up being trained and taught by the imams in Saudi Arabia. Now remember, if you're from, if you're a Muslim and you're living in China and you believe that the root of your religion is in Saudi Arabia, and you go there and they say, oh, you're practicing kind of a perverted form of Islam, you need to go back to the true form of Islam. Here you are in Mecca, here you are in the Holy Land. You might be inclined to believe it. You might be inclined to say, wow, okay, so this is the real Islam, and what we're doing over there is a perverted version. So a lot of the imams that went to pilgrimage in Mecca ultimately went back to China, went back to the Xinjiang region, to the Uighur people, and brought in an extreme version of Islam, which we know is Wahhabism. And they brought that in and started radicalizing the population even more so, alongside the Mujahideen who they were already being exposed to. So there was this kind of double exposure going on, the imams coming back from their pilgrimage and also the Mujahideen fighters, and all of that was starting to infiltrate the Islamic culture, the Islamic people in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. So of course, inevitably, the enemy of your enemy is not really your friend and ultimately ends up being your enemy as well. So beginning in 1990, so very shortly after all of this began, within a 5 to 10 year window, terrorist attacks began in the Xinjiang region. These radicals would come back, or from their camps, or from pilgrimage, or from just being taught by the imams who came back from pilgrimage from Mecca. And they would believe that they wanted to live like many of the jihadists that are fighting, ISIS, Taliban, Al-Qaeda. Many of them, they want to live in their own caliphates. They want to live under Sharia law. They don't want to live under a government. So beginning in 1990, a lot of terrorist attacks began. And of course, mixed in with this, what makes this whole thing very complicated, were ideas of separatists, of making the Xinjiang region a autonomous region for the Uyghurs only. So there were Uyghur nationalists mixed in with these Islamic extremist Wahhabi types. And so, it's kind of a blend, and a lot of those joined forces together to say, yeah, we've got the same end goal. We want to be separated from mainland China. So there was a blend of all of this going on. You can't really pin it to one thing or the other. But since 1990, there have actually been lots of terrorist attacks going on in China in that region. starting in the 90s, there were a lot of bus bombings that were killing a lot of people. Then you move into the 2000s and continued to have bombings. Then there were knife attacks where people would walk around with long machetes and actually slice people to death. And these terrorist attacks had been going on in China. I actually had video, but for whatever reason, my system's not letting me play it, of the various different attacks that have been going on over there. But from 1990 to really up until 2016, I think their last attack was in 2017. They haven't had an attack in 3 years. But there was an attack every year, but it really heightened. It really started to escalate around 2011 to 2014. There was a big escalation in the attacks in that Xinjiang region, or sometimes they would spread outside of the Xinjiang region, but they were always, the attackers were Uyghur, who had become extremists. Now again, most Uyghur people who are Muslims, not all Uyghurs are Muslims. There are still Buddhist Uyghurs, there are secular Uyghurs, but most Uyghurs who are Muslim are not Wahhabists. They are Sufis. They are also under attack. They are also viewed as infidels, and they're the ones who are being terrorized by these extremists inside of their own country. They're being terrorized by groups that believe that they're the true followers of Islam and these Sufi Muslims are not. That's what makes this so dangerous. So again, China being very, very secretive, and Asians in general being very afraid of shaming the family, shaming the culture, shaming the country, kept all of this very quiet. China didn't want to share its inside problems with the outside world for several reasons. One, as I mentioned, Asian shame is a real thing, real thing. I can't stress it enough. For those of you who are watching who are Asian, like myself, you understand the shame is a real thing. Secondly, China didn't want to alarm the population. China is a country with a massive population, and when there's panic, the panic can be very severe and have some real severe consequences in China. So they didn't want to also have a rising up of panic. And they also didn't want the outside world taking advantage or judging or pointing their fingers or saying, hi, you've got all these problems and you don't know how to manage your own country because you've got people bombing you and slicing people up in the streets and you're a terrible government. And, they just didn't want to have the outside scrutiny as well. They didn't want any outside forces taking advantage of this. So, but what we do know, because China's now started to talk about it a bit more because they realized that they were being scrutinized for some of their tactics now of how to deal with Wahhabism, that they started to open it up. And there's actually a documentary, and I will put the link down below later for you guys, and you can watch that documentary. It is from China. It's a Chinese documentary. It's from the Chinese government, essentially. So, keep that in mind, that it's coming from their perspective. But I think it's important to see their perspective. And the footage is real, But beginning in 2014, so there were all of these terrorist attacks that were going on in this region, and China finally realized that they couldn't allow this to continue. People were in panic because of these terrorist attacks. I mean, imagine people with machetes walking around. It's bad enough to think someone's going to blow you up. The thought of being blown up is scary, but the thought of being hacked to death with a machete is even scarier to me. That's just me, though. So beginning in 2014, China said, okay, you know what, we've had enough. We have to do something. We cannot just allow this to continue. So I'm sure what they did was kind of looked around the world to see how others reacted to terrorist attacks. Mind you, we had one terrorist attack against us in this country on September 11th, and our response was to invade 2 countries, to start war, and to bomb people. Our solution was to eradicate these Wahhabi extremists, to blow them off the face of the earth, and if we happen to catch them, to then ship them off to an offshore prison and torture them in Guantanamo Bay. And if we found them in our country, inside of our borders, we again would round them up in the middle of the night and take them offshore where they could be tortured. That was our response to terrorism, to one terrorist attack. That clearly was not a winning solution. It's destabilizing, it's terrible, it's inhumane. So China decides instead to open up what they call re-education camps. Now, I know a lot of people want to say, oh, that's just what they're calling them. They're re-education camps, but really they're concentration camps. These people are being tortured there, and people have a lot of ideas, and those might be true. I don't know. We don't know, because China's not really being as forthcoming about this as they could be. They have toured people around the camps, but the people say, yeah, but we only saw what China wanted us to see. That's fair enough. That's fair enough. But I will say that re-education camps are something that Asian countries have been practicing for a long time. And my grandfather actually went to a re-education camp and was in one for 4 years. So he got out. He was in the Southern Vietnamese Army. Obviously, when the North ended up winning the Vietnam War, they sent anybody who was in the military in a high-ranking position, they sent them to re-education camps. So my grandfather went to a re-education camp. I don't know much about his experience in the re-education camp, except I know he was there for 4 years. He got out, and then he wrote the family letters when he was living in Laos. At that point, he had left. But he never said anything really about his experience, whether or not he was tortured, whether or not it was, anything of that nature. I don't know. He just said he had gone to a re-education camp for 4 years. But he did come out. They did let him go. The same government. It wasn't a new government that overturned Vietnam and all of a sudden all the people in these camps were freed. It was, he was there for 4 years to be reprogrammed, to be re-brainwashed the way they wanted him to be brainwashed, and then they let him go when they felt like he had been brainwashed enough. So this isn't new in Asia, and this is what China's solution is. Now, the estimated number of people in these camps is 1 million people, but nobody really knows how many people are in these camps. That estimated number was based on 2 studies that were done, and they admitted that the studies were really limited. One study, they asked 8 different people in 8 different little communities in the Xinjiang region how many people they thought had been rounded up from their community and put into the camps. Then what they did was they estimated that percentage out, and they found that when they talked to the 8 people from these various different little villages, that it was about 10% of the local Uyghurs were being taken away into these camps. So that's how they come to the 1 million. They then said, okay, well, it must be 10% of all Uyghurs that are going to these camps, even though, the major cities, of course, are different. Smaller towns, people are much more likely to be radicalized than in larger cities. So the math, sure, could it be 10% and could it be 1 million of the Uyghur population? Yeah, it could even be more for all we really know. We don't really know, but it's most likely less than 1 million. That's a very high number when you start to factor in the more metropolitan areas. But that's how they came to the 1 million number. There's about 11 million Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region. The Xinjiang region is not all Uyghur. There's actually a large Han Chinese population there as well. It's majority Uyghur, but only by a little bit. It's maybe 48% Uyghur and like 45% Han Chinese. So it's almost 50-50. But the 11 million Uyghurs, they figure then there's about 1 million, a little over 1 million that are in these camps. But they don't actually know. Now, in looking at all the satellite footage of all the various camps, when they say, oh, we found more camps, we found a camp here, we found a camp there, we found a camp here, you'll notice when you're looking through the footage, and I encourage you to do some of this research yourself if you can, but if you look at all the footage, you'll notice that there's no people in these photographs. They're taking satellite images of empty fields, and then a year later they see multiple buildings pop up and they assume these are camps for Uyghurs. That's a large assumption. Maybe those buildings are for other things, like, I don't know, manufacturing clothing or manufacturing goods, or, we know that China's had a booming economy over the last several years, the last few, maybe even a couple of decades, and that they've got a lot going on, and of course, you need buildings and you need facilities for that. So to automatically deduce that anytime you see a blank space on a satellite map, that suddenly a year later there's a grouping of buildings there, to suddenly think that that's a Uyghur camp, education camp, or concentration camp, or whatever you want to think it is a bit of a stretch. None of the photographs have any people in them that I saw at this point. So our information is very limited. So people are saying that there is a cultural erasing going on, that China's goal is to lock up all these Uyghurs, to essentially commit a cultural genocide on these people, to erase the Uyghurs and their culture. That couldn't be further from the truth. And I'll tell you, the first way you'll know is that China's actually trying to promote tourism in the Xinjiang region. They want you to go visit. They want you to go and see the Xinjiang region because the Uyghur culture is so colorful and beautiful. They've got great food that is very different from the rest of China's food. You know, it has a bit more of that Middle Eastern and Western Asia influence to it. They want you to see the beautiful costumes that the Uyghurs wear. They wear brightly colored dresses. They have a special form of dance. They've got rituals with when they eat, and it's all very unique in that region of China. Very unique, very interesting, and China wants you to go see it. So they're not trying to culturally erase the Uyghur culture. What they are erasing is Wahhabi culture. They have banned beards and veils. Beards and veils are not Uyghur culture. Beards and veils are Wahhabi culture. So they don't want to see men with long beards. They don't want to see women covered completely up. They actually ran campaigns for a long time trying to get the women to drop the veils before they made them illegal. They actually tried to convince the women to not wear them. They were running ad campaigns saying, let your beautiful face show, let your hair blow in the wind. You know, they were doing what they could to try to get the women to stop living this more radical version of Islam. And so to say that they're being that the Uyghur culture is being erased is not really true. They are trying to stamp out any sort of visual clue of Wahhabism. Also, during China's one-child policy, so you remember when China made it to where you could only have one kid. Guess who was exempt from that policy? That's right, the Uyghurs. China said everybody can only have one kid except ethnic minorities. Don't worry about it. Have as many as you want. So they let the Uyghurs have more than one child. They were not saying to them, one kid for you and everybody else gets to have as many as they want. That would be trying to eradicate a group of people from your population. Instead, they said, if you're an ethnic minority, a non-Han Chinese ethnic minority, you are exempt from the one-child policy. They've now changed that, of course. They've kind of loosened up the one-child policy. People are now allowed to have more than one kid. And after now it's been, I believe, 20 years or even 30 years of the one-child policy, they recently did change the laws in the Xinjiang region where they said, okay, you can now have almost as many kids as they can have. They're allowing the Han Chinese, because if you're a young mom and you're seeing the Uyghur mom have 3 or 4 kids and you're only allowed to have one, that felt very limiting to the Han Chinese in that region. And so China did change the laws. But the fact that they didn't implement the one-child policy on the Uyghurs tells you right then and there that they were not trying to eradicate this group of people. One thing China recognizes is that part of the radicalization, so what turns a person to become radical? They have this Muslim part of China. They're not trying to stamp out Islam. They have actually a majority Muslim population, the Hui, the Hui Muslim Chinese. That's actually the Muslim majority population in China, and they are not being sent to education camps at this point, although that might change. And the reason why we might see there might be a change in policy with the Hui Muslims, because I just want to share with you a little bit of this article. This is an article that was written by Farah Pandith. Farah Pandith was under the Obama administration, she was essentially the ambassador to Muslim nations and ambassador to Muslim communities, Muslim people. under the Obama administration. And she actually took a trip to China, and she took a trip to China years ago when she was under the Obama administration. And she wanted to go and meet with the Muslim communities inside of China, and she did. And what she said in this article, and I will link it down below for you, is she was shocked by the Saudi Arabia Wahhabi influence that had infiltrated the Uyghur Muslims. She had noticed that there was a big, shiny new mosque that had been built with Saudi Arabia money, and that it was clearly teaching people a more radical version of Islam. She then went down the road and went to a more traditional mosque for the area for those people, went in and saw the women were dressed differently. They were dressed, they weren't dressed as, they weren't as covered as the women in the big shiny Saudi Arabia mosque. And she spoke to those women and she said, what's going on with that mosque down the road? And they said, oh yeah, that's foreign Islam. It's really not good and it's starting to take over. So there is a possibility, and that comes from the mouth of our own Muslim ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Muslim nations. That came from her, where she said she saw it with her own eyes in China, that there was an extremism on the rise in that area. So that's possible. The article is called "Extremism is Riyadh's Top Export." So I will link that down below. It says Saudi Arabia is fighting for a dangerous monopoly on Islamic thought. So China recognizes that, and they say this in their state-sponsored documentary on the extremism that they're fighting. They recognize that part of the radicalization, what would turn a young Muslim man, which usually it's the young Muslim men, to become radical, they say it's a lack of opportunities and a lack of education. That usually when a person is feeling like they've got nothing else going for them, they will turn to radicalization, because radicalization will at least tell them that there's something waiting for them on the other side if they do XYZ. So that is why China says they felt like the best thing to do was to open up these re-education camps, where it was essentially and yes, it is forced, a forced college. I'm not, like I said at the beginning of this, I'm not saying what they're doing is the right thing. I'm also not saying it's the wrong thing. I just don't know. But it's certainly, I think we can all agree, better than marching into a country, blowing it to bits and pieces, toppling their government, taking people and carting them off to Gitmo, where they're going to be tortured. I think we can all agree that maybe attempting to unbrainwash or re-brainwash with better brainwashing is maybe a better, more humane method. So what they're trying to do, they said, is we put them in the camps, we educate them, we give them opportunities, we give them skills, education, and de-radicalize them. They say what they're doing in these camps is teaching them Islam, but they're just teaching, they found that many of these radicals didn't really know anything about Islam. They were taught this extremist version of it, and they couldn't really answer basic questions about Islam, and so they're trying to get them to follow a more mainstream form of Islam, a non-radical, which is the majority of Islam. So regarding reports of torture or abuse, it's really hard to verify. So that could be going on in these camps as well. Hard to verify. Obviously, there is an effort by the Wahhabi community to get China to stop taking away their people and unbrainwashing them. So obviously, they would have an incentive to claim that there's something really terrible going on in these camps. So I think, like I said, there very well could be, but we should be at least open and honest and keep our eyes open as to what might actually be a motive for somebody to be claiming that. The West also has a real win-win situation by demonizing China in this situation. One, it could force China to stop, which means the extremism continues and destabilizes like it does in other countries. We've seen this, and it's a good working strategy. If you want to keep a country down, if you want to keep a country from rising up and gaining power, then you need to keep some infighting, a bit of a civil war going on. Look what happened to Syria. Look what's gone on in Afghanistan. You've got Lebanon, Egypt. You've got a lot of nations that when there's unrest going on, they're a bit unstable. And if you can really ramp up that civil unrest, then you end up with a civil war, and you end up with factions taking over areas of the country, and it's sucking up all the time and energy of that nation. So one, it's a really good strategy if you want to destabilize China. If you think China's your competitor, then it is a win-win situation to demonize China, because if they stop, then they end up with this extremism problem. If they don't stop and they continue to try to re-educate and get these people to think in a different way, then they can continue to paint China as a monster that we must defeat and even set up possible regime change attempts. So it gets the American people on the side of China's a monster, China's terrible, so this could create a new Cold War with China, which of course obviously is good for the military business. This could also create a situation where China's just viewed as the big bad guy, the big horrible human rights abusing bad guy. Now China doesn't have a squeaky clean record, so of course, when you could take an ounce of truth, you can blow it up into a much bigger thing. And because China has such a history of, they're hell-bent on this one China policy. So Tibet and Taiwan and Hong Kong, you've got all of these regions of China that would like to have more autonomy, and China's clamping down on that. They don't want them to have autonomy, or they're demanding that they don't have autonomy. And there are these Xinjiang nationalists that do want to be separated from the main China, and there's that as well. So China's got a lot of different things going on, a lot of moving parts. It's a really big country with billions of people, so there's a lot of moving parts going on there, and not all of them are the same. So it's easy to kind of say, okay, well, what's going on in Hong Kong must be going on everywhere else. All of the different situations are different. The situation in Tibet is different than the situation in Hong Kong, which is different than the situation in Xinjiang. And China, though, often may be wrong on how they treat their people, because they are a very oppressive society. People aren't free to speak for themselves, or not free to have their own voices, their own thoughts. That is true in China. It is much more oppressive than the West, for sure. Eastern nations have a tendency to be that way. It's a very different culture. It's a different way of thinking. And unless you grew up in it, like I did, I'm a person with a unique perspective, because I'm half Asian, half Western. I've got East meets West, and I understand how difficult it is for the two to understand one another. It's almost impossible. So China's going to do things differently than we do things, and and they're a competitor. So it's a really good thing for the West to continue this propaganda of what China's doing is wrong. But again, one of the reasons why I'm bringing all of this up is because I want us to have start looking at the situation with Wahhabism in a much and other types of terrorism. But Wahhabism is particularly dangerous. All extremism can be very, very dangerous. But what's interesting about Wahhabism is they're able to raise literal armies. You could get some fringe wackos here in the United States who are on 8chan swapping ideas, and then maybe they go and they do something really atrocious. They attack people, they shoot people, and it is terrible. That is true. But Wahhabism has been able to raise armies that have actually toppled governments. They're a serious, real, huge threat. This is not just a one-off extremist group, something you can kind of contain a little bit here and there, like you can the racists in America who do have these radical ideas and then end up doing crazy, horrible things. You can hopefully find those one-off people or small groups of people and contain them. But we are talking about, again, the ability to raise a literal army. We have to ask ourselves, luckily we don't have to deal with this in the West as much, but we do have to ask, what is the most progressive, most humane way to deal with these extremists? Obviously, the United States answer was terrible and wrong. We invaded 2 countries. We then took people away and tortured them. We put them in Guantanamo Bay with no due process. That is inhumane and wrong. Then the government decided to spy on all of us and have continued to extend the Patriot Act. So we've got all of these real issues when it comes to the way our government, the way the West has decided to handle extremism versus the way China's dealing with it. I think we should have a conversation on what do we do? Do we allow Wahhabism in our borders? Do we shut down the mosques? Do we say you cannot preach that here? The thing about Wahhabism, it's not just freedom of religion. We are talking about a religion that actually, this form of Islam, and it's a very small little minority group of this, they teach violence. It really does propagate violence. They're saying everybody is an infidel that doesn't believe in our way, and they deserve to die a violent death. So you can practice your religion, and I think all of us are open. We all want freedom of religion. But at what point does that religion cross the line and become an ideology that incites violence? And then if we can determine that it is an ideology that actually calls for violence against the government, against their neighbors, against anybody, then what are the rules when it comes to that? Do we then say, okay, we're going to make Wahhabism illegal and you cannot preach Wahhabism in this country? That is where we draw the line. If you want to preach that, well, then you go to jail because that you're inciting violence. Do we want to go down that road? Do we say, no, we have to let them preach it until they actually do it so they can say it all they want, but only until they do it do we put them behind bars? But what if the group is so large that they could raise a literal army? What if you made the mistake as the country and you actually started encouraging them to go and be trained by the literal armies, and to you've essentially created the extremism inside of your own borders, thinking that it was going to just harm your enemy and not turn on you? Some things that I want to point out, I know this is going long, but this is why I did this as a live stream, because there's just too much to talk about on this. But there have been a couple of public, international condemnations of China for this practice. There was 22 nations signed a letter condemning China for the camps and saying this was a human rights abuse and this was terrible. The countries that were involved on that list, I want to read to you the nations. So the 22 nations, you've got like Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Japan, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom. So interestingly, the United States was not on that list, but this was a letter condemning China for their camps. Now, 4 days later, another group of countries came forward and said, we're actually going to defend what they're doing because they're trying to get rid of extremism. And those nations, you notice that the first group of nations are very Western. The other nations that were actually saying, you know what, China's got a point, were actually, many of them, Muslim majority nations. You have Algeria, Angola, Bahrain, Belarus, Bolivia, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Cambodia, Cameroon, Comoros, Cuba, Dominican Republic of Congo, Egypt. Some of these I cannot pronounce, guys. This is embarrassing. Eritrea? Can you guys help me out with that one? Gabon, Kuwait, Laos, Myanmar, Nigeria, North Korea, Oman, Pakistan, Philippines, Qatar, Republic of Congo, Russia, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, interestingly, on the list. Saudi Arabia is the one who was exporting out Wahhabism. Although Saudi Arabia was sort of asked to export Wahhabism by the West. So yeah, they had it in their own country, but the reason it started really spreading around the world was because the West asked them to do it in order to help destabilize countries we didn't like China. Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Tajikistan, Togo, Turkmenistan, United Arab Emirates, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. So you notice a big difference on the nations that actually said, you know what, you're doing the right thing. We're not going to condemn you. We're actually going to support you. You're trying to eradicate this extremism that is that you brought in. They didn't really infiltrate. You can't really say they infiltrated your country. China kind of created the problem on their own by inviting them in. Also, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Uyghur Act back in December. I believe the vote was 407 to 1. There was one lone, believe it was Representative Massey, was the lone rep who voted against the Uyghur Act. There were several who sat out, who did not vote, Tulsi Gabbard being one who did not vote on this, which I think is the right move. But the House passed the Uyghur Act, which called for sanctions on China until they stopped the camps. So when the U.S. House of Representatives passed that act, the Chinese Muslim Association came out in support of their government and said, mind your own business. Don't come after us. You don't know what's going on here. We'll decide what are human rights abuses against ourselves. Now, of course, you could always say, well, they were told to say that by the government, and if they didn't, they were afraid, and you can say a lot of things, but that's what happened. They came out in support of what was going on, saying, let the Uyghur people decide what the human rights abuses are. Now remember, 90%, even if there are really truly 10% of the Uyghurs in these camps, which they don't even know if that's the real number, that's actually a high estimate of 10%, that means 90% of the Uyghurs are out and about, free to live their lives, including free to practice Islam. They just can't practice Wahhabism. That is the line China has made. So recently, some reports came out saying that there were leaked documents from China, what they were looking for when they were detaining people. They're looking for people with the long beards. They're looking for the women that are fully veiled. They're looking for people who visit certain websites. They're looking for signs of Wahhabism. And if there are signs of Wahhabism around you, or if you're exerting signs of Wahhabism, then there is a chance you're going to end up in one of these re-education camps. So again, this isn't to say that China is blameless or even harmless in all of this, but we just need to understand what the situation actually is. They've got this rise in extremism that they helped bring in. They decided that they needed to do something about it because of all of the major terrorist attacks that were going on in their nation. They could have rounded all of them up and deported them. I don't know where. They can't really do that because these people are from there. They're not foreigners. These are people from China, born and raised in that region. And they did not choose to round up all of the Uyghurs. This is not some kind of a cultural genocide going on. That's not true. China is trying to get you to go visit. They want you to go check it out for yourself and go partake in the Uyghur culture throughout the entire region. So let's go over some of the counter arguments that I've been hearing all day on Twitter. I need to take a little drink. Hold on, sorry. This is going long, guys. This is like an hour. And this is really not very, it's not put together well. I'm actually quite tired from doing all of the research. I'm going to redo all of this in a more succinct video for you tomorrow. And I'm going to put it all together with the footage, I promise. I'll get it out to you, and I'll put it in a better message that doesn't take 1 hour. I'll make this more succinct, but I just needed to do something today and to talk about this, and then I'll probably take this down and put out another one, a better one, because this is a mess. This is a hot mess. I'm a hot mess. Okay. Some of the counter arguments. The stance at these camps are perhaps justified isn't a progressive stance. I get it. A lot of people saying to me, I am not progressive. This isn't a very progressive thought. My question is, what is a progressive way of handling extremism? And we're not talking, again, the random kid sitting in his parents' basement on 8chan. We are talking about potentially, if the number really is, let's say, 1 million, 10% of the Uyghurs have been radicalized. What would you do if 10% of your town had been radicalized into some weird, brainwashed sect of religion where they believe that you need to die? They'd sooner rather slit your throat than have a conversation with you. What would you do if 10% of that infiltrated your town? How would you combat it? What is the progressive answer? I think it is more progressive to try to re-educate them, to say, I don't think it's progressive to let them just continue on, because we've seen what's happened to Afghanistan. Afghanistan's a perfect example of what happens if it just continues. Suddenly, everybody's living under the Taliban, and women aren't free. Girls can't get educations past the age of 8. People are stoned to death, heads are cut. I mean, allowing your community to get to the point where the Taliban has now taken over and they're now in control of your town and you now have to live under that, that to me is not the progressive stance. I'm not saying I have an answer to how to deal with a 10% radicalized population, But I could tell you that certain ideas are more humane than others. If you're going to have a prison, which we have in this country, we have a prison system. If you have a prison system, what do you want the inside of those prison systems to be like? How do you want those prisons to operate? If the option is not, don't have them, let the people go, that's not really the option. If the option is you have to have the prison, then you'd want the prison to truly be educating the people, giving them hope, skills, education, right? You'd want that. Even though they're trapped there, that's what you'd want the inside of those prisons to be. So that's what China claims they're doing. That's what they claim they're doing. We don't really know. Another criticism, the way to breed extremists is to throw them in these camps and create resentment. Yeah, that is true. This is sort of a chicken and egg situation. Why did so many of the Uyghurs become radicalized to begin with? Well, because they probably felt oppressed. They probably felt a lack of opportunity. They probably felt poor. They probably felt like they didn't have a future. And so they were easier to turn to a radical form of Islam that would teach them that the afterlife has something really special in store for them, especially if they go and commit acts of jihad. So it is sort of a chicken and egg situation. And of course, the way to prevent extremism would be to educate people, give them hope, give them opportunities, right? That would be a way to prevent extremism. But when they've already become radicalized, it becomes a lot more challenging. People that are radicalized are not going to voluntarily go and be re-educated. They would view that as brainwashing, because it is. It's like a form of maybe positive, but it's still a brainwashing. So they're not going to go and voluntarily go and do that. So this becomes really sort of challenging. Another criticism, but it is true that putting extremists in camps is creating more extremists, but also marching in and blowing them up is creating more extremists. I don't know how you're going to, I don't know what you can do once somebody's already radicalized. I don't know what you can do that isn't going to create resentment. And I can say this, though, they've had no terrorist attacks in the last 3 years. Ever since they started doing this in 2014, and then since 2016 or 2017, they haven't had a terrorist attack. Another criticism, China is eradicating Uyghurs because they want the resources from the land. China's always had control over that land in one way, shape, or form. That land is, like I said, historically Han, and then it had Turkic people, and then it was Mongol rule, and then it was back to Han. I mean, that region has been all around. It was a part of the ancient Silk Road. It's going to be a part of China's future New Age sort of Silk Road that they're building. Their belt and I forgot right now what they call it. I'm really tired. So trying to eradicate the Uyghurs because they want the resources from the land. No, but they certainly don't want separatism. They're not going to let them go. China's not even letting Taiwan go, and Taiwan is not really part of China. So they're not going to let this region go. That is for sure. They definitely don't want to break up any part of China. Here's another one. We should support freedom of religion, and this isn't freedom of religion. It really depends on your definition of religion. If your religion is actually preaching that you should be killing people, and they're advocating for violence, and they tell you that's how you get into heaven, that's how you go to paradise, I don't know if that's, I mean, there are many weird religions that could have, they could tell you to sacrifice children. Should we allow that? They could say you've got to rob people or beat people. I think there's a line when we say I don't know if this is really, I don't know if you could really classify Wahhabism as a religion as it is a extreme ideology, maybe political even. This isn't about religion. This is about the desire by the Uyghurs to have autonomy and freedom. That's really why they're rising up. There is a bit of that. There are some Uyghurs who are more about nationalism, but then there are a lot of the jihadist Uyghurs, and they both have kind of come together in this common desire. But it's by no means the majority of Uyghur people that want to be separated from China. It is not a majority in that region. There are some people, but you could find that in every state in America. You could go to every state in the Union and find some group meeting in some basement or talking online, talking about how they want their state to be separate from the U.S. And you don't even have to go that far in places like California and Texas. You don't even have to go to online chat rooms or basements. You can go into big rooms where people really, truly want to be separated from the rest of the country. But you can certainly find that in every part of the United States. So it's not really an argument to say, well, these people want to go. There are always going to be people who want to go. Doesn't mean we let them go. This country fought an entire civil war where 500,000 people were slaughtered just to keep the country together, to prevent separatism. China is against religious minorities, but that is not true because currently the Muslim majority group in China is not being targeted. So the Uyghur Chinese are not Wahhabists yet, although, again, I'm going to point you to the article that was written by Farah Pandith, who was the U.S. ambassador to the Muslim nations and Muslim communities around the world under Obama, where she did see Wahhabism starting to creep into the Uyghur Chinese, and that's alarming. So we'll see. But, you know, not everybody who's even taught Wahhabism really truly ends up becoming super radical. It's most aren't, but it's still, they've got a radical ideology. They might be sympathetic to people who commit acts of violence. What about Tibet? So yeah, Tibet is another situation. China's a big country, lots of billions of people, lots of moving parts, lots of different things going on. And Tibet is its own situation. It is nothing like what's going on with the Uyghurs. They want autonomy. They want to separate. It's more like Hong Kong or Taiwan. But the situation in Xinjiang with the Wahhabi element that has crept into Xinjiang is different. And the last criticism that I'm going to tackle tonight is people can change. The way isn't to put them into camps, is to show them humanity and to give them opportunities. Yeah, for the non-radicalized ones that you're wanting to prevent radicalization. But again, if you've already got 10% of your population radicalized, if that has already happened, then I don't know if you could show humanity to the Taliban or humanity to Al-Qaeda or humanity to ISIS and get them to change. I think you got to be honest about that. I don't know if just going in there with like books and saying, I'm going to re-educate you, Taliban. I mean, do we really think that's a working strategy? If a group of people actually sat in on a strategy of how to convert the Taliban away from their extremist ideology, because remember, the Taliban are people. These are individuals who are in Afghanistan living an extreme lifestyle. They're individuals. Do you really think that you could go in there and teach these individual Taliban people in their community to not be Taliban? I just don't think that's actually a working strategy. So, I mean, I think we just have to be realistic, and I think we need to be, realistic about how do you combat that level of extremism. So I think you can definitely stop the radicalization of people by giving them opportunities, by showing them humanity, by giving them a future to believe in, a future to desire for sure. But if they've already been radicalized, if you're already dealing with Taliban-like people, I don't know how you're going to do that without, like I said in the beginning of this, I don't know if the way China is doing it is the right way. I also don't know if it's the wrong way. I don't know. Is it wrong to say, you know what, you've been radicalized and we're going to take you somewhere because you need to be reprogrammed so that you can be a working, functioning citizen in this society and not want to harm all of us, and not teach your children to want to harm all of us, and not tell your wife that she's got to, cover all up and that she's your property or whatever it is. I mean, these are the types of things that I think we need to be opening up for discussion in this country rather than demonizing other people. Okay, guys, I'm going to open it up for questions. I wasn't going to, but I'm going to now, since I'm going to probably redo this video tomorrow and put it out there. So if you have questions, thank you so much, Nate, for your contribution. My headshot on Wikipedia is 9 years old and needs updating. Thank you. Yes, it does. I was much skinnier back then, wasn't I? That's what happens. That's what happens. But thank you so much. Okay, guys. Well, I'm gonna shut this down for the night, I think. All right. That's it for the night. I'm going to redo this in a more succinct video. Thank you so much, Saul. It is not, I want to repeat, it is not Islamophobic to be anti-Wahhabism. Wahhabism affects Muslims more than it affects anybody else. The Uyghurs that are under attack in the Xinjiang region are under attack by their own extremist Uyghurs. It's the extremists are attacking Uyghurs. They're attacking Han Chinese and they're attacking everybody. They don't care. They don't care at all. So we've got to be open mind. You know, we've got to be understanding of what is going on. Thank you, Jinho. Thank you so much. All right, guys. Thank you very much. This video is going to be taken down, and I will redo it tomorrow in something that's a bit more succinct and shorter. And I appreciate you watching. I'm going to go to bed. I did a lot of research on this and a lot of fighting on Twitter. Got to go now. This isn't the right. All right. Bye, guys.